Hello. What's up, everyone? Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 15. My name is Sam Hoppen. I'm your host for the show. We've got this open to the public today. Hopefully have some people joining in live. If you haven't watched the show before, this is where I go through some of the key stats that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week, what's happened the past couple weeks, and hopefully give you some insights as to what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. We got the fantasy football playoffs coming up for the next couple of weeks here. Want to make sure as many of you bring home a championship as possible. But before I get into the details, want to talk through quickly, the stats that I'm going to be using today so that everyone knows where I'm getting them. From PFF is where I get all of my routes data. So that's any routes specific metric, that's targets per route run, anything with routes in it, really. I also use their expected fantasy points, which is a model built that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage. And I primarily use this as a measure of usage for players to understand which players are getting the highest value opportunities on their team. From the NFL play-by-play data, or NFL Faster, is where I get the majority of my stats. That's where I get air yards, which is the distance that a ball travels in the air before it gets to the receiver. Have weighted opportunity rating, or Whopper. That's a stat that Josh Hermsmeyer created that weights air yards share and target share. Also have Racer, which is receiver air conversion ratio. That's receiving yards divided by air yards, and is essentially a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. On the flip side, have Pacer, which is passing air conversion ratio, passing yards divided by passing air yards, and shows how well a quarterback or the receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. And then quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but it weights it with a negative given to interceptions and a bonus for touchdowns. Also have pass rate over expectation and completion percentage over expectation. CPOE, as I'll refer to that. Those are both models built in NFL Faster that calculate the expected rate at which a team would pass and the difference between that and their actual pass rate. And then CPOE is the expectation of a quarterback completing his passes, and then that subtracted from his actual completion percentage. Also have a couple of stats that have been popularized by Ben Gretsch. That's weighted targets per route run, which is targets per route run, but weights air yards and routes run a little bit differently with a scaler included. Also have high value touches, which is a running back specific metric. This is carries inside the 10-yard line and any reception. I'll also refer to green zone touches, which is any touch, whether it's carry or reception, inside the opponent's 10-yard line. So I'm going to be going through the stats position by position today, hoping to compare against others in the position to help you make your start sit, your waiver, trade decisions if you've still got that open, and maybe put a little DFS spin on it as well. A reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel and become a member for just $5 to get early access to this show, get access to the Discord, a bunch of other benefits, and one final shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who has been doing an awesome job adding timestamps to the YouTube page for each of the positions and team conversations. So if you're listening to this or watching this after the fact, which I would encourage you to, because I'm going to throw a couple charts up here in a sec, you can skip ahead to specific conversations. If you consider me talking to a screen of conversation, skip to whichever ones you want to in that. So without further ado, I'm going to throw up the first chart here, going to talk through the quarterback position. On the x-axis of this chart have adjusted yards per attempt, have touchdown rate on the y-axis, and then the size of a quarterback's bubble as his rushing yards per game. This first chart looking at the last 5 games for the quarterback position. And the first guy I'm going to talk through is someone that appears on the top right of this chart, somewhat surprisingly, and that's Jimmy Garoppolo. He is actually the highest graded quarterback by PFF since week 8. He only has an 82 grade, so I think that's more of a factor of the QB play in the rest of the league, and not necessarily that he's blowing things out of the water, but he has been pretty solid for the 49ers. So again, over his last 5 games, is averaging about 236 passing yards per game, averaging 2 passing touchdowns per game, has fewer than 1 interception per game, and has a pacer of 1.11. So getting a lot of help from his receivers, which is not unsurprising given the Kyle Shanahan scheme and how well he schemes open receivers and they convert their yards after the catch. But he also has a 7.2% touchdown rate, a 9.0 adjusted yards per attempt. All of those are at the top end of quarterback play over the last several weeks. He's only averaging about 16.5 points per game from a fantasy perspective. So still not where you would, expect to be starting him in any season-long league, but has shown the ability to have some ceiling games for sure in the past, especially when, he gets a couple touchdowns to Kittle and Ayuk and can convert on those. The obvious thing with the 49ers too is that they run the ball a shit ton. They, over the last 5 weeks, have a negative 10% pass rate over expectation. So they're running the ball on 10% more plays than you would expect to. And that's just the way that San Francisco is going to operate with Jimmy Garoppolo or with Trey Lance. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to see Trey Lance. But the other thing I'll add is that Garoppolo has a 5.3% CPOE over the last 5 games, which is good for 5th over that span. So it's good from a fantasy perspective because he's not absolutely killing the pass catchers with his terrible quarterback play that he usually has, and has been one of the more efficient quarterbacks for sure. Hasn't, if you are starting him maybe in a 2 quarterback league, hasn't been killing you by any means, but hasn't been winning you any weeks either. Now, another guy that's had a little bit less success recently, which is, again, pretty shocking, is Dak Prescott, who, if you'll remember, in the game in week 6 against the New England Patriots, he had a calf sprain, and then they went on their bye in week 7 and then returned in week 8. And he's played in 6 games since week 8, and it has not been very good for Prescott. He's averaging about 40 attempts per game over that span. The Cowboys have a 3% pass rate over expectation. So from a fantasy perspective, we've got Crosby in the room here as well. You can hear him shaking off. I'm sure he'll find his way into the back view of the camera here. But anyway, so Prescott, he's throwing a ton, and that's great for volume for the pass catchers, who I'm actually going to talk about later in the show. But he has not been his normal efficient self. He has a 3% touchdown rate over that span, a 6.1 adjusted yards per attempt, is averaging just 1.3 passing touchdowns per game, and is averaging 1 interception per game, which is not fantastic. Has a negative 3.4 completion percentage over expectation. And if you look at the splits between the last 6 games for Prescott and the 6 games prior to that, it's night and day. His game has clearly dropped off quite a bit. And I was listening to a podcast, I don't remember which one, but they were talking about Prescott and how he doesn't want to essentially throw off of his back leg. I don't remember his back leg, but he doesn't want to be on the run and passing. And that's why you saw in the game on Sunday on the pick 6 that he threw on the rollout, he rolled out and stopped and then tried to throw it to, I think, Schultz. And then the guy picked it off and ran it all the way back, when normally you'd see a quarterback continuing to run through that and throw the ball. So this isn't all doom and gloom for the pass catchers, but Prescott's only averaging 15 points per game for fantasy over his last 6 games again. And that's not going to cut it. I mean, best ball teams that are going into the playoffs with Prescott hope that he can return to health here. And I'm going to flip over to the next chart, which just shows performance from this past week. You can see Prescott down on the bottom left part of this chart, which is not where we want to see him. I've designed all these charts so you want to see players in the top right of the charts. So one other thing to point out from the quarterback position, Kyler Murray's just playing out of his mind right now. I mean, he's absolutely crushing it. Obviously lost the game last night and didn't have his best game, but still had a 3.4% completion percentage over expectation, has a 7.2% CPOE on the season, which by far leads the league. And then you combine that with what he can do rushing the ball, and it's just insane. He's for sure a quarterback 1 for fantasy and will continue to be so. There were some reports right before I jumped on about DeAndre Hopkins' health, and that's obviously a minor concern, but I don't think will truly hurt Murray's ceiling that much. All right, going to move on to the running back, position. And on this chart, we have rushing expected points on the x-axis, have receiving expected points on the y-axis, and then a player's fantasy points over expectation per game, I'll refer to that as FPO, is the size of the bubble. And that's essentially showing which players are over or underproducing relative to expectation. And the first backfield that I'm going to talk about is the backfield up in Green Bay with A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones. And we've had 2 games now. Aaron Jones missed 1 week and then came back. For the game against the Rams, they had the bye and then played against the Bears on Sunday night this week. And things have turned quite a bit in Dillon's favor. Over the last 2 games that they played, Dillon has a very nice 69% share of the backfield touches. He has 7 green zone touches, 11 high value touches, is averaging 20 opportunities per game, 17 and a half carries per game, and is just blowing Jones out of the water in terms of usage. He's only averaging about 1.5 points per game fantasy wise, because Jones has found the end zone a couple of times, but it's really good to see Dillon maintain this level of usage with Jones back. Again, in the past 2 games, he's had 4 and 3 green zone touches, had 8 and 3 high value touches. Jones did have 4 high value touches in the game, this past week. And I think where Jones still has a bit of an edge is with the pass catching Dillon did not record a target in the game this past week, I don't believe. So, I mean, they've used Jones, splitting him out wide, but the usage overall is there. Dillon had a 54% snap rate in week 14, which was his highest snap rate in a game with Aaron Jones so far this season, his second highest of the season overall, behind his 75% snap rate in week 11 when Jones was out. So, I think this is a situation where Dillon is probably becoming the 1A, and it could be a situation where the Packers are sort of saving Aaron Jones a little bit for the playoffs. I thought, coming off of the week 12 game with Jones only getting 11 opportunities, that it was, sort of the fact that they were up ahead big and they could just use Dillon to salt the game away. And then he got more opportunities than Jones again in week 14. So it's certainly a trend right now and doesn't look like that's going to change. They do play the Ravens this upcoming week potentially without Lamar Jackson. So that could be a game in which they're in a positive game script as well. But Baltimore's rush defense hasn't been spectacular this year. So I think both of them are startable because Jones does and always will have that touchdown equity, or the potential to have touchdown equity. But it's getting much, much closer to 50-50 than the sort of 65-35 split that we had in favor of Jones earlier in the season. So the next backfield I want to talk about is the Giants' backfield. And it's not so much about the backfield, but it's about Saquon Barkley, who, if you read my teaser tweet, I do not think is a must-start running back anymore. He had a season-low 55% snap rate in week 14, and I'm sure some of that was due to them getting blown out. He's been back since week 11 from returning from the injury and is averaging 17 and a quarter opportunities per game, has a 67% share of the backfield touches. That is a 17% target share, is running a route on 58% of dropbacks. His receiving expected points per game is at nearly 9 per game, which is fantastic for a running back, but he's just been so inefficient this entire year. He ranks 30th in rush yards over expectation at negative 0.2 rushing yards, under expectation per rush. And so, yes, the volume is there, and yes, he's getting touches, but they're not really high value touches. I mean, this was the first time, week 14 was the first time since returning from injury that he got a single green zone touch. His high value touch numbers are good since returning from injury. He's averaging 5 per game there because he's involved in the passing game, but hit a season low 58% routes run rate, 44% routes run rate, which was his lowest in a game that he played fully this entire season. Hit a season low, season low 58% share of the backfield touches in a game in which he played fully. The other guy that's obviously cutting into this work is Devontae Booker, who has gotten 10 and 13 opportunities in the last 2 games. Has gotten 4 high-value touches in each of the last 2 games and ran a route on the same number of dropbacks as Barkley did in this week 14 game. So, again, this could all be a factor of them getting blown out by the Chargers, them not wanting to risk Saquon Barkley later on in the game. But again, he's been trending down in terms of usage from a share of backfield touches perspective, from a routes run perspective, from an opportunity perspective the last couple of weeks. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe we see a situation in which they shut Barkley down for the year. I don't think that that's something that the Giants really would entertain at this point. And there is a little bit of cause for optimism. If you're looking for one, he's averaging -2 fantasy points over expectation and is averaging 15 expected points per game. So a sign that he clearly hasn't been efficient and hasn't been able to take advantage of his opportunities. But I wouldn't fault you if you're starting someone else ahead of him, sort of in that range. All right, I'm going to flip the chart over then to the week 14 only stats for the running back position and cover the Falcons running backs, because I haven't really talked about them that much for a while. I mean, for pretty much all of season, Cordero Patterson's just been absolutely crushing it. The efficiency continues to be through the roof, just the opposite of Saquon Barkley. And the workload is there as well on top of that. And over the last 5 weeks, he's averaging 16 opportunities per game, has a 47% share of the backfield touches, 12% target share. What is interesting is he only is running a route on 39% of dropbacks. So it seems like the Falcons are transitioning him more into the, like an actual running back and lining him up out of the backfield. He's been below 45% routes run over the last 3 weeks. Missed the week 11 game, obviously, but only has 2 games this season, Patterson does, with fewer than 3 high-value touches, had 2 green zone touches this past week, and is just like, you're going to continue to start him averaging 14.7 PPR points per game over the last 5 weeks, averaging nearly a touchdown per game. So just a diamond in the rough from early in the year. But I want to talk about this backfield because Mike Davis saw 17 total opportunities, which was his most in a game since week 5, and had a 41% share of the backfield touches. That was his highest since week 8 when he was at 50%. He still doesn't have a green zone touch since week 5, had 5 high-value touches in the game this past week, and has run a route on 57% of dropbacks in back-to-back weeks. Now, this Falcons team is not that great overall. I mean, they're a team, they're a little bit lost. They're still in playoff contention, which is kind of crazy. And Davis is averaging fewer than 9 PPR points per game. But if you're strapped at running back, I think you could find worse options. Davis has found the end zone a couple of times in the last 5 weeks and is getting used on a team that lacks playmakers right now. I mean, Russell Gage is leading the team in target share over the last several weeks. So that tells you enough about that. But over the last 5 weeks, he also is averaging more receiving expected points per game than Patterson. He's at 5.9 and Patterson's at 5.8. So not a huge advantage, but the fact that he's getting that much passing work at all is, I think, a shock to me. Has at least, 3 high value touches in each of his last 4 games after a stretch of only 1 game with over 2 in the previous 4. So Mike Davis, someone to obviously keep an eye on. The other part of this backfield is Quadri Allison. He's seen 3 and 5 opportunities the last 2 games, but did see 12 in the Week 11 game that Patterson did miss and got 2 high-value touches in that game as well. So probably the next man up if Patterson gets hurt, but Mike Davis, I think, would see the biggest spike. I mean, you could see him here on the chart, just a very large share of the receiving work in the game this past week. Speaking of running backs getting a lot of receiving work, surprisingly, is Devonta Freeman. And, you know, you can say what you want about Freeman being dust and all that, but he is getting a pretty solid workload over the since week 9. He doesn't have a single game with fewer than 14 opportunities. He's averaging nearly 20 opportunities per game since week 11, has a 74% share of the backfield touches, is averaging 7.7 receiving expected points per game, 9.7 rushing expected points per game, and is averaging over 5 high-value touches per game as well. I mean, these are all just outstanding numbers. And I mentioned earlier that they're playing the Packers this upcoming week. The Packers don't have a great rush defense either. And it could be a game, even if Lamar Jackson is healthy, that they could be relying on their running backs a little bit more to take the load off of Jackson if they want to. It did suck this past week to see Latavius Murray come in for the one goal line rush from the 1 yard line and plunge it in for a touchdown. So that really sucked. But excuse me, Freeman has run a route on over 60% of dropbacks in each of the last 2 weeks, which is just outstanding. He hadn't been above 50% since week 9 and are the first 2 times he's been above 60 all year. Has been above a 60% snap rate in each of the last 2 weeks as well. And, you know, this is I don't want to say huge shift, but a bigger shift from what we saw earlier in the week, earlier in the season. Obviously saw Le'Veon Bell getting involved, Tyson Williams, and Latavius Murray for a little bit looked like he was the primary backfield there. But Freeman has separated himself from the pack in the backfield, is very clearly the Ravens running back 1 right now. I mean, Murray, I was trying to say Latavius and Murray at the same time, but Murray, he only had 1 opportunity this past week. That was the 1 carry that I mentioned. Had 4 the week before and 8 the week before that. So his usage is just declining week to week. Hasn't been above 30% of snaps in each of the last 2 weeks either. So Murray's still someone I think worth holding on to as a potential handcuff, but it's not only great to see Freeman separating himself, but getting work in the passing game and when the Ravens getting close and having some of that touchdown equity as well. A couple of final nuggets for the running back position. This is from John Daigle and Jared Samola covering the Panthers backfield. So Abdullah actually outsnapped Hubbard 59% to 39%, ran a route on 59% compared to 23% for Hubbard. Hubbard did have more opportunities. He had 10 carries, but didn't record a single target. And Abdullah got all 4 targets out of the backfield. Daigle also noted that Abdullah outsnapped Hubbard 11-2 on 3rd and 4th down as the primary receiving back. The Panthers played the Bills, the Bucks, and the Saints next. So it could be an opportunity where Abdullah gets the majority of the opportunities just based on them being down and having to pass the ball. Clyde Edwards-Helaire only got 13 of 29 running back touches in a game that the Chiefs led from the get-go. He had 8 of his 14 touches in the first half. On the flip side of that, Josh Jacobs only had 9 carries, but no other Raiders running back got a touch until the final 2 drives of that game. And those notes coming from Ben Gretsch. Melvin Gordon returned to the 1A role yesterday. This from Adam Levitan. Gordon had 34 snaps, 24 carries, and 8 routes. That's compared to 33 snaps for Williams, 15 carries, and 15 routes. They both found the end zone a couple of times, so they were both usable in that game against the Lions. And I think, again, this is just probably what's going to happen for the rest of the season, is you're going to see a pretty even split between those two. Something to note, though, I think, for this upcoming week, the Cardinals do face the Lions this week. James Conner, something to monitor is that he left the game on the last snap. So he could be dealing with injury. Chase Edmonds could be back, but if they are both active, I would not be hesitant to starting either of those Cardinals running backs. Okay. Moving on to the wide receiver position. Thank you all for continuing to tune in to this live episode of Stat Chasing. Be sure to hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the Stat Chasing YouTube. But the first wide receiver group that I'm going to talk about today is the Panthers wide receivers. I know a lot of people are interested in DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, and going to look at the last 3 games since Cam Newton took over as the starter in week 11. And I don't want to say it's an even split between Anderson and Moore, but it's certainly closer than it was earlier in the season. So in the last 3 games, DJ Moore is averaging 9 targets per game. That's good for a 29% target share. Is averaging 100 air yards per game, which is good for a 39% air yard share. And that's all equates to a 0.68 Whopper, which is incredible. Really good for a receiver. Is running a route on 95% of dropbacks. Has a weighted targets per route run of 0.72. Very, very good numbers. You can see him up in the top right part of this chart here. Has a 2.44 yards per route run. It has an 11.1 average depth of target, averaging about 15 PPR points per game. So DJ Moore still really solid, but what I think is more interesting is that Robbie Anderson has come on a little bit. They both have a receiving touchdown in the last 3 games, and Anderson's averaging 7.3 targets per game, about 76 air yards per game, and has a 30% and 24% air yard share and target share, respectively. He's also running a route on 95% of dropbacks over the last 3 games and has a 0.57 weighted targets per route run. He's only at 1.3 yards per route run, which is not great. Not necessarily what you want to see, but his ADOT has come down significantly to 10.4 yards in the games that Cam has started. A couple other things on Robbie Anderson's sort of emergence here. He had 12 targets, which in the game in week 14, which was the first time that he out-targeted DJ Moore out all season, was the first time since week 6 that he's had double-digit targets. Also had 149 air yards in this game. His first time over 100 air yards since week 5. Again, the routes are absolutely fantastic. Had a 0.93 weighted target per route run in week 14. So that's just outstanding for Anderson, and also had 21 total fantasy points in the game in week 14. DJ Moore, again, he's been consistent and he's been good. He just hasn't been great like he was earlier in the season. Over the last 3 games, all 3 of his fantasy point totals fall between 14 and 16 PPR points. So, again, solid, consistent, good, but certainly not great in what you would expect to see from him. Has been at a weighted targets per route run of 0.72 and above in each of the last 2 games, which is absolutely outstanding. Has 10 targets in each of the last 2 games, this coming after a stretch of 3 straight games with only 7 targets. So the usage still there. I think it's just a matter of the efficiency and being able to hit those explosive plays. But I'm not worried about Moore heading down this stretch run. Regardless, we'll see. It sounds like Cam Newton is going to be the quarterback again. We'll see how long he's the quarterback in the game before PJ Walker takes over, but would be confident starting DJ Moore, I think, regardless of who is under center. Okay, so now is my time to stack my stat chasing here and talk about the Cowboys wide receivers, and going to look at their stats since the Week 8 game, that first game back after, Dak's calf strain. And things have been good for CeeDee Lamb still. He's averaging 8.8 targets per game as a 23% target share, 31% air yard share, running a route on only 71% of routes, though, which is what we saw in that first game, but is averaging 14.5 expected points per game, has a 10.5 average depth of target, and is averaging 92 air yards per game. I'm not worried about Lamb. He's seeing plenty of usage. But Amari Cooper has been a little bit different. He's obviously been a little bit hurt over the past couple of weeks, but since week 8, he doesn't have more than 7 targets in a single game. And let's see, he's averaging 4.5 targets per game. Has a 9.4 average depth of target, but only a 12% target share, and is running a route on 74% of routes. Has a very low 0.36 weighted targets per route run. So Cooper not looking the greatest as of late. And it looks like, maybe could be due to his health, but Michael Gallup has certainly turned it on since returning from injury. He's averaging 8.2 targets per game, leads the team with a 33% air yard share, second on the team with a 20% target share, is running a route on 90% of dropbacks, has a 0.54 weighted targets per route run, which is solid, and is averaging negative 2.2 fantasy points over expectation per game in those last 5 games. So certainly I think he's in line for just a massive week. Hasn't had more than 15.5 PPR points in a game since returning, but again, is running a route on almost every dropback in each of these games. Had 73 air yards this past week after 3 straight games, over 100 air yards, has had at least 8 targets in each of his last 4 games. And he's getting valuable work too, because his fantasy expected points have all been above 12.2 in each of the last 4 games. The last thing I'll mention here, Cedric Wilson continues to be sort of the fourth fiddle, if you will. He's actually averaging 6 targets per game in his last 4 games, which is more than Amari Cooper, but is running a route on 64% of dropbacks, has just a 16% air yard share. So someone to keep in mind, if one of the primary receivers gets hurt, then he certainly steps up immediately. All right. Let's see what we got here. We got the Steelers wide receiver group up here next, and I'm going to switch to the week 14 chart for you all to all take a look at. So, where do we stand with the Steelers? I want to talk about them because I haven't really touched on them much since the 1 week right after Juju got hurt. But the story is kind of the same. Deontay Johnson continues to just absolutely dominate in this offense, has a 37% air yard share, a 30% target share. This is all over the last 5 weeks, is averaging 12.2 targets per game, has just 2 games below 10 targets all season, just 1 game below 6 targets all season. I mean, he's just an absolute machine in terms of usage. And let's see, he has a 0.84 racer, which is extremely good, a 0.68 whopper, running around on 98% of dropbacks, averaging 20.9 receiving expected points per game, just continues to crush it here. Chase Claypool obviously is next in line. He hasn't had quite as good of usage, has a 19% target share, which is still second on the team, averaging 7.3 targets per game, just under 100 air yards per game, but is clearly the deep threat in the offense, has a 13.8 yard average depth of target after 2 straight games over 120 air yards, has just 50 and 76 the past 2 weeks. And I don't know, it's kind of weird because he's been at 65% and 58% routes per dropback rate the last 2 weeks. So I don't really know what that's about. I mean, that's kind of weird. But he's still been at over 13 expected points in 3 of his last 4 games. So Claypool remains a flex option for sure. His per route numbers are quite good as well. Has a 0.22 targets per route run. Overall, in his last 4 games, running around on 79% of dropbacks. But the other 2 guys, the next guy, excuse me for clearing my throat so much, but the next 2 guys are Ray McCloud and James Washington. Ray McCloud seems to have stepped into that Juju role for sure. And he's averaging 6.5 targets per game. He missed week 12, but over his last 4 games, again, 6.5 targets per game, has a 16% target share, which is just 3 percentage points behind Claypool. Has a 0.9 racer. He's running a route on 65% of dropbacks, but has just a 6.2 average depth of target. He had 8 targets in the game this past week against the Vikings, which was his second most of the season. His most came in week 10 with 12 when Claypool missed the game, but certainly his most usage in the game in which both Johnson and Claypool were involved. He ran a route on a season high 91% of dropbacks this past week. So this could be just a 1-game anomaly in which McCloud got more usage, maybe because of the matchup or something the Steelers saw. But I'm not taking that as cause for concern with Claypool. I still think has more explosivity in his game as well. Someone who used to have some explosivity, but really hasn't shown it, the last couple of weeks is Mike Williams, who was set up to have a huge game this past week without Keenan Allen, but got just 6 targets in the game and turned that into 61 yards without a touchdown. He stepped out of bounds on one of his catches, and he was streaking down the sideline, and he stepped out like 20 yards before he got touched, which was really, really tough to see. He had a 3.2 average depth of target in this game, only had 19 air yards. So they certainly sort of put him into the, I call that the Keenan Allen role, because Keenan Allen's average depth of target is a little bit further down the field than 3 yards, but much different than his 11.2 yard average depth of target that he had the 3 weeks prior. And his 6 targets, I mean, he hasn't had more than 8 targets in a game since week 5. I mean, he just can't get used. He's not getting used for whatever reason. Even though he's on the field, he's running a route on 90+% of the team's dropbacks. And he does have at least 12 PPR points in 3 of his last 4. So that's better than the 5 points per game he was averaging from week 6 through 10. But he just does not have the explosion in him anymore. The other 2 guys to talk about, though, are Jalen Guyton and Josh Palmer. I think huge credit and props to Pat Kerrane for calling Josh Palmer in his weekly walkthrough article as the better play. And Guyton ended up outscoring Palmer by just a tad because he had the long touchdown on a fantastic throw from Herbert, but Palmer ran a route on 94% of dropbacks compared to just 71% for Guyton. He out-targeted him 7-3. Palmer also had a touchdown, had a 9.6 average depth of target, so he almost filled into that Keenan Allen role. A little bit. Had a 29% air yard share in that game. So I think if Allen were to miss the game Thursday night, Palmer is still the better bet. Guyton, on a week-to-week basis with Allen and Williams, has more explosivity. I don't know why I keep using that word, but has more explosiveness. That's probably the correct word, because he's gotten a couple of downfield shots. And in the 3 weeks prior to this past week, was running a route on 59% of dropbacks compared to just 37% for Palmer. Now, hopefully we get Allen back. Hopefully we get the Mike Williams back that we saw earlier in the season. But it just seems like there's some miscommunication going on with Williams and Herbert, because, I mean, he's just not targeting him. It's almost like Williams is out there being used as a decoy almost. So some of the underlying metrics, say that you should continue to start Mike Williams again. He's on the field, which is extremely important. It's just his targets per route run is at 0.18 over the last several weeks, which is not great. You want to see that over 0.2 for most receivers. A couple other quick nuggets for the wide receiver position here. Donovan Peoples-Jones had a 0.7 Whopper this past week. That was a season high. The Browns are dealing with a COVID outbreak and could be without Jarvis Landry on Saturday, so someone to keep an eye on. Deebo Samuel has seen just 6 targets over his last 3 games, but he's carried the ball 22 times, so is just, I guess, doing his best Cordero Patterson impersonation. And then Hunter Renfrow had a 31% target share, ran around on 96% of dropbacks which was his second straight game over 95% after not getting over 85% at all in the season. So he's really having a great season, an underrated player for sure. Okay, the tight end position, and then got a couple teams to talk about. Gonna go through these fairly quickly here to stay around an hour. But a couple guys I want to talk about. First is Noah Fant. Had a really good start to this season, but he's sort of had some similar struggles with Jerry Jeudy coming back. He's still running around on 71% of dropbacks, averaging 4.5 targets per game over the last 4 games for him, which is good for a 15% target share. That's third on the team behind Jeudy and Patrick, but has just 4 targets in each of his last 3 games and 4 of his last 5 games after being above that in 6 of his first 8 games. So the usage, not quite there. It seems like this offense is trending towards being just sort of a run funnel, I guess, going through, their running backs. Doesn't have a game above a dozen PPR points since Jeudy returned or since week 6 when he was above, again, 12 PPR points in 4 of his first 6 games. So I think someone you're still probably continuing to trot out there. There aren't many better options at the tight end position, but is certainly closer to a tight end 2 at this point in the season. Excuse me. The other guy who had a hot start to the season, who is sort of returning back to his old self, is Mr. James O'Shaughnessy. He missed a good chunk of this season due to an injury, but has had at least 5 targets per game in the last 3 games that he's been back. Has a 16% target share, running a route on 74% of dropbacks. Is only scoring, hasn't scored more than 6 PPR points per game in each of his last 3 games. So the ceiling is definitely not there. But the usage is there. I think is worth a dart throw in DFS tournaments for sure. He's usually around mid price. And with the way this offense plays, probably won't carry that much ownership, but has been at a 0.2 targets per out run rate in each of the last 2 weeks. And again, could just find the end zone one of these weeks. Travis, a couple final notes here on the tight end position. George Kittle just continues to dominate. It's so good to see him back. Another top tier tight end who hasn't had quite as much success is Travis Kelce. He's now been held under 30 receiving yards in 4 of 13 games this season. Certainly not ideal. That from Adam Levitan. And then a young tight end that a lot of people really like. Didn't have a great game fantasy-wise this past week. Had 3 targets on 40 attempts. Is Pat Freiermuth, but he ran a route on a season-high 80% of dropbacks. Okay. Going to get into a couple team-level situations here to round out the show. The first of which being the Seattle Seahawks. Russell Wilson is now back. He's been back for 5 games. It feels like it's only been like 2 or 3, but he's been back for 5 games and hasn't quite been his old self. But the Seahawks have a 2% pass rate over expectation since he's been back. Wilson is 10th in the NFL in CPOE at 0.3%, is averaging 32 attempts per game, has just over 1 passing touchdown per game, a 4% touchdown rate, 6.7 adjusted yards per attempt, but is throwing the ball extremely deep, averaging 330 passing air yards per game, a 10.1 average depth of target. So that is really a boost to at least one of his receivers, who I'll talk about here in a second. But before I do want to talk through, the running backs real quick. Rashad Penny had one of his best games for sure this past week. Was given 17 total opportunities, scored about 27 fantasy points, has had double-digit opportunities in each of his last 2 weeks, has had a green zone touch in each of his last 2 weeks, and has had 2 high-value touches in each of the last 2 weeks as well. If he's healthy, he certainly looks like he'll be the lead back for the Seahawks for the rest of the season. I would expect their pass rate over expectation to dip a little bit given what the Seahawks have done in the past. But Alex Collins, I think, also someone to continue to hold on to. He had a big role through that long stretch of the season when a bunch of their backs were injured. Still had 8 opportunities in the game against Houston as well. But the big story is with the wide receivers. Their 2 main guys, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and how they've performed since Russ returned from injury. And the usage is very similar, but the production is not. Lockett has a 22% target share to just a 23%, to a 23% target share for Metcalf. So Metcalf is leading the team in targets. They're both running a route on over 85% of the team's dropbacks. They both have an average depth of target over 14.5 yards, but Lockett is getting a lot more of the air yards, or at least he did this past week. He had 234 air yards this past week, was able to turn that into a 25-point fantasy performance, and has been above a dozen PPR points in each of the last 4 weeks. Meanwhile, Metcalf hasn't been above a dozen PPR points since Russell returned from injury in week 10. So the other thing to note here, though, is that Metcalf has been over 80 air yards in each of his last 5 games. Has been above 110 in 3 of his last 5. Again, has 8 targets in 4 of his last 5 games as well. So I think the big game is coming there for Metcalf. Just needs to find the end zone at some point and convert those air yards into receiving yards. Has a very low 0.33 racer. Gerald Everett, someone to keep an eye on as well, running a route on 72% of dropbacks, 5.8 targets per game, good for an 18% target share, which is second on the team as well. The last team and the last group of players I'm going to talk about are the New Orleans Saints, because they are now led by Taysom Hill, who I think rightfully say is not a good quarterback, has a negative 16% completion percentage over expectation in the 2 games that he started, has the 3% touchdown rate, a 4.8 adjusted yards per attempt, just 17 completions per game, 4 interceptions to just 2 passing touchdowns. But really, none of that matters, because he's averaging 11 carries per game over his last 2, 87 rushing yards per game, is finding the end zone on the ground as well, and he's been scoring an average of 23.5 fantasy points per game. So it doesn't matter if he sucks at quarterback, at least not for himself, because he can rush and make up for it that way in a fantasy perspective. But the big story out of New Orleans is that Alvin Kamara returned from injury after missing 4 games due to injury and was just put right back into a massive workload. Had 32 total opportunities, which was his most in a single game this season. Ran a route on 67% of dropbacks, 6 high-value touches, 3 green zone touches, which is really great to see in a game that Taysom Hill started. Had 5 targets in the game and 120 rushing yards. Just an absolutely fantastic day for Kamara. Had 24.5 PPR points. The other guy to get involved was Tony Jones. He had 7 opportunities, ran a route on 41% of dropbacks, but he is the de facto he will play the Mark Ingram role if Mark Ingram remains out this upcoming week. But Alvin Kamara should go right back into your lineups. Obviously, hope that Taysom continues to give him some green zone touches when they get in close. I said that Taysom Hill being a bad quarterback was okay for him and didn't really hurt his fantasy value, but it hurts the fantasy value of his pass catchers outside of Alvin Kamara there. So in the 2 games with Taysom Hill, no player, well, let's see. There's a lot because a lot of them haven't been totally healthy. Tre'Quan Smith has just 10 targets. Nick Vannett has 10 targets as well and is tied for the team lead with a 16% target share. Nick Vannett, probably the biggest winner over the last several weeks, ran a route on 78% of dropbacks, which was a season high for him. Again, he's had at least 7 PPR points in each of the last 3 games, which again, it's not fantastic, but can sort of do the job for a tight end. But Tre'Quan Smith and Marquez Callaway are the 2 sort of steadiest options in this offense. Tre'Quan Smith, like I said, had only 3 targets in the game this past week, but before that was averaging about 7 targets per game. And Callaway has had exactly 4 targets in each of his last 5 games, but lost my train of thought here. Has a 10-yard average depth of targets, 22% air-yard share. So he's getting some downfield work. Deontay Harris, has missed one of the past 2 weeks. Missed this past week, but he will also play a factor. This offense is just it's both unconcentrated. The Saints do not want to pass it with Taysom Hill. They have a negative 5% pass rate over expectation. So you'd be really hard pressed to start any of these guys in a season-long format. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that because there's not a lot of fantasy value here in this Saints receiver group. But that's going to do it for the show today. Again, please remember to subscribe to the YouTube, become a Ship Chasing member for just $5 a month. I would highly recommend that. I know the end of the season is coming up here, but I'm sure there will be a lot of great conversations in the Discord this offseason with best ball, with drafting and all of that. Be sure to tune into the show tomorrow evening at 9:15 p.m. Eastern. I will be back again next week at 3:15 p.m. Central. But until then, stat that.